Good morning to everyone. Welcome in Bonn. Like any other achievement within the domain of human activity, philosophy has its history. However, since its inception, it has been an essential character of the philosopher to begin anew. The reason for this is not, or at least not only, narcissism, ambition, or naivety, but it is part of the practice of philosophy to engage with reasons, that is, simply with what follows from what. Philosophical reasoning is meant to clarify our general standing in and relation to the world. It explicates this relation to reality in terms of specific concepts we deem indispensable for our moral, political, aesthetic, or scientific, as well as our everyday engagement with what there is and how things are. Realism is a term with a long history. As its Latin root reminds us, it is originally entrenched in the scholastic debate regarding the ontological status of concepts, in particular universal concepts. I'm not making this observation in order to reconstruct the history of realism from medieval scholasticism. Don't worry. However, it's interesting that the realism debate originally did not at all pivot around the problem of the external world. The original question was not whether there really are physical objects independent of our grasp of them, but rather whether there really are concepts independent of our grasp of them. What is new in contemporary, and in particular 21st century conceptions of anti-constructivist forms of realism, is a renewed sense of the original set of questions associated with the term realism versus nominalism. We have become aware that realism is not just a first-order metaphysical position affirming the existence of a physical world existing anyway, antecedent to any and all attempts of knowing and asserting its existence. Nor can it be reduced to a semantic problem as Dummett suggested. The reality or realities realism is concerned with are not necessarily tied to assertability conditions, even though it might be helpful to clarify their conceptual structure. Rather, a new set of questions has appeared which relates both to realism about reason, as I would call it, and realism about the social. Realism about reason departs from the observation that a constructivist account of reason itself or reasoning, for example, an anti-realist reading of late Wittgenstein, fails to account for objective reasons, that is, the very reasons which may motivate the account itself. We need to be able to draw a stark contrast between mere justificatory habits or dispositions and inferential facts. The later term denotes facts determining what actually follows from what. Otherwise, the Kripkensteinian skeptic will return and destroy our attempt to make sense of reasoning itself. If reasoning were merely some blind, objectively frictionless activity of dialogical exchange, maybe oriented by deference to holders of power, such as experts or other authorities, we might indeed give up the project of modernity, that is, the project of ultimately rational self-determining institutions of freedom. Realism about reason itself is therefore not only a philosophically appealing position to be spelled out in many areas, such as the epistemology of logic. Defending realism about reason is also in part a defense of an overall culture of freedom, one where the self-determining activity of free thought is the paradigm of our attempt to establish truth. Hence, the theoretical questions associated with realism about reason are not detached from the questions of realism about the social. As John Searle has convincingly argued, social construction and the construction of the social need not coincide. Institutions are not just mass hallucinations governed by some internal structure to be investigated by critical theories from psychoanalysis to Marxist ideology critique, or once upon a time fashionable culture theoretical rumination about deconstruction. The fact that the social is ontologically different from inanimate matter or dreams does not entail that objective social facts do not exist. The normativity of the social may, in fact, pose difficulties of assessment. However, this does not entail that we find ourselves in the indissoluble predicament similar to the trial in Kurosawa's movie Rashomon. After the epistemological turmoils of the last 2 centuries, which confronted an ever-increasing body of scientific discoveries and social turbulences, we are now in a position to reshuffle the terms of the debate. The prospects for what we call a new realism do not lie in a rehearsal of a set of standard arguments, but in the attempt to generalize a realistic attitude towards facts, one which is not premised on the paranoid or skeptical idea that all there is might simply be some sort of private or mass fantasy-mongering activity. Establishing a proper concept of facts, accordingly, of social facts, is not limited to an academic discipline we call philosophy. On the contrary, it's time to reshape our attitude to cultural projects, to the spirit of the time, as it were. It's our aim with this conference to contribute to such a renewal by investigating the prospects for a new realism from various perspectives. As in pictorial representation or in real-life perception, a difference in perspective is not evidence for contingent or even arbitrary construction. On the contrary, perspective is evidence for objectivity. The fact that I can see you from here or from there, in this or that particular perspective, is not usually understood as evidence that you are not there. It is time that we apply this quite ordinary insight to the humanities again. Perspective is not a threat to objectivity, but may sometimes be part of our solution of the relation obtaining between how things are and how we conceive them to be. Before I introduce our first speaker, it's my obligation to thank the institutions who made this event possible. First, I would like to thank the Fritz Thyssen Foundation, the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg Recht als Kultur, our Institute for Advanced Studies, for their generous financial support. The conference is hosted by our International Center for Philosophy, which is designed to host international events such as this one in order to contribute to the global discourse of philosophy. The center is run by our Department of Philosophy with a board of external members, and it's directed by our 7 chairs. International centers such as this one have helped implement an ever more borderless philosophical discourse. Even though we all still teach and work in national institutions, the Forum of Philosophy has become an international scene where we meet regularly in very different locations all around the planet. Our International Center for Philosophy is funded in order to add yet another stage to this development. The conference is organized in cooperation with the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg, directed by my colleague from Sociology and Law, Werner Gebhardt, as well as the Laboratory for Ontology, the Italian Society for Analytic Philosophy, and the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory in Belgrade. I wish us 3 stimulating days of intense and controversial debate, as well as new insights into what really follows from what. Furthermore, I wish our guests a great time here at the University of Bonn, where, before realism arrived, Nietzsche was trained in classics, Karl Marx studied law and was acquainted with romantic theory of literature under August Wilhelm Schlegel, and, even worse, Carl Schmitt wrote his political theology in 1922.